Danielle, and I'm Mercy Corps' Resilience Director. And I wanted to share just a little bit about market systems resilience and share about the work that we were able to do over the last week in Abuja with some of the Rural Resilience team. And this is important because it's critical to our activity to be understanding and operationalizing our resilience approach. So I want to start by sharing a little bit of background with you all about why we're talking about market systems resilience. So as we know, our goal is to impact smallholder farmers and micro enterprise owners in our 4 target states of Northeast Nigeria. We want to have impact, but we really want to make sure that this impact endures. And so we think that bringing the resilience lens into our market systems development approach is really critical to ensuring that impact is sustained, not just beyond the program cycle that we have, but also into the future when new risks and shocks and stresses affect the Northeast. So the resilience lens is key for that. Secondly, as I think we're all aware, Rural Resilience is one of Mercy Corps' critical flagship programs. In this program, we are really driving the next generation around resilience learning and evidence, and we're really putting into practice some of the approaches that have been put on paper, but we really need to see how they work now through the programs. So we need to get this market systems resilience piece right so that we can continue to not only learn ourselves, but also inform the broader Mercy Corps world and the industry that's also looking to practitioners like you to figure out how to do our work differently. Finally, the work that we're doing together on market systems resilience contributes to a broader growing body of evidence around market systems resilience. USAID, for example, developed their own MSR framework that Mercy Corps has since adapted, and that's what we'll be talking about today. But even beyond that, there are a lot of questions among donors about how applicable is resilience in really fragile contexts where conflict shocks really define the setting. And so we're contributing to this industry thought leadership, and it's really critical that all of us can understand why market systems resilience so that in our work we're applying these concepts and we can capture what we're learning. So just really quickly, where are we trying to go? I think we all have been, to one extent or another, exposed already to our typical good market systems development approach and the strategic framework. And as we know with MSD, the question we ask is, why isn't the market system already providing pro-poor solutions on its own? And once we identify why it's not, then we ask, well, how can we facilitate systemic change rather than directly contributing to or providing the change ourselves? So for rural resilience, if we go from the bottom to the top, what we're looking at is how do our RRA interventions ladder up together to deliver market systems that work better for specific outcomes and impact for smallholder farmers and micro enterprises. And then how do those market systems actually translate into change, other outcomes for smallholder farmers and micro enterprises? And finally, the impact that we're looking at the highest level, increasing income, improving nutrition, and ensuring peaceful management of conflict in our target areas. So as just a good MSD program, this is what we're trying to achieve. And as you know with MSD, it takes time to show impact. Because this is a systems approach, and because we're really working at scale, it takes time to see this impact curve, if you will, this red line on the slide, go up. But once it goes up, we expect that this change will be more sustainable. It will continue to improve over time, as opposed to some of our traditional direct delivery models where there might be a short-lived impact, but over time we don't see that sustained if there isn't broader systemic improvement. However, it takes time to achieve this impact, and as time goes on, what we know is that there are shocks and stresses. None of the environments we work in are stable. There are always risks that are affecting the systems and the people we work with. So we need to understand when and how shocks and stresses are coming into this picture, and we need to be able to anticipate and plan for them. But more than that, we want to see how we can plan for risk through a systems approach. So this brings us back to where resilience fits into the MSD strategic framework. we add some of this resilience logic into what we're already trying to do as an MSD activity. So instead of asking just about the market system, we ask, why isn't the market system delivering or sustaining resilient solutions for our end impact group, even in the face of shocks and stresses? And once we identify why that isn't happening, then our question is, how can we actually facilitate systemic change that builds resilience into the market system? So going from the bottom to the top, what we're trying to do is see how can our RRA interventions account for resilience, and if they account for resilience, then we think there will be market systems that work better even in the face of shocks and stresses. And when these market systems work better, when there are shocks and stresses, then we want to see outcomes, specific outcomes for smallholder farmers and micro-enterprise. And these outcomes would also prevent or reduce the impacts of shocks and stresses on farmers' incomes, on their nutrition status, and would contribute to peace. And together, we still want to see the same impact: increased nutrition, increased income, and peaceful management. But we see this impact being sustained over time because we're looking at it from a resilience approach. Really quickly, just a couple of key definitions so that we all have the same vocabulary as we work on this concept together. As we know from Mercy Corps, our resilience definition, resilience is the capacity of people and systems to maintain or improve their well-being in the face of shocks and stresses. And when we talk about resilience, we're really talking about a few core components. One, if I start from the right and go to the left, we need to see what is the well-being we're ultimately trying to support. Then, what are the shocks and stresses that undermine that well-being? Who are the people that we're talking about whose well-being we really want to impact, and what are the systems that they live within? What systems really underpin their well-being? And then finally, what different capacities do these people and these systems need to manage shocks and stresses in such a way that when they're affected, either nothing bad happens or we see that they're actually better off, even when they're facing different risks. And just to talk a little bit about shocks and stresses, because this is really critical to our activity, rural resilience, and understanding how we organize around these. When we're talking about shocks and stresses, we're talking about events that we can typically identify with a starting point. And with shocks, they're usually short-lived. Sometimes they're really quick onset, and they can be felt just at an individual or household level. They can be felt at a community level. They can even be felt at a national level or across borders. These are things like losing your job, seeing intercommunal violence, or a crop pest infestation. Stresses similarly have usually a time where we can point to this is sort of when we saw a new trend occurring and it introduced a new disruption into our lives. So these kinds of stresses that we're looking at could be soil degradation, rising fuel prices, movement restrictions, inflation of the Naira. So shocks and stresses are really key for us to understand how we're working on resilience. They're different from what we typically think about at MSD programs as systemic constraints. Shocks and stresses are not systemic constraints. They're different, but they definitely make those constraints worse. So systemic constraints are the things that we're already trying to change through a systems approach. These might be things like poor policy enforcement of a tax law, or low representation of women in extension services, or a general lack of financial services available in an area. Systemic constraints are kind of characterize systems, but shocks and stresses are a disruption or an acute or longer term disruption really into these systems. Systems themselves, I think this, I hope this diagram looks familiar to all of us. This is our kind of market system donut, and systems are really critical to understanding resilience as well, because we understand that there's a core function happening that's really where the target group we're working with are concentrated in the main core function of the market system. Around them are different supporting functions like information or services or inputs. And then helping to make that whole system work, we have different beliefs, attitudes, rules, and policies that form the bottom of the donut. All systems are impacted by shocks and stresses. If people are impacted by shocks and stresses, people are part of systems, so systems are also impacted. And these shocks and stresses can occur at different levels. They can happen to the supporting functions of a market system, where a lot of businesses are providing services. They can happen in the core function of a market system, where individuals might have reduced demand all of a sudden, or they can happen even on the bottom part of the market system donut, where we're talking about shocks and stresses that might change the way that a market system itself is governed. Resilience capacity is another really important definition for all of us. And at a very basic level, a resilience capacity is just a resource or a strategy that you can access and use in order to address shocks and stresses. So let's take an example. If this slide shows us a typical participant in our program, Fatima, a farmer from Butte, let's say, looking over at what is the well-being outcome that Fatima is trying to reach. We're looking for sustained increases in her income and her nutrition. And we also can see a poverty line here. And what we want to see is that Fatima over time continues to progress out of poverty in such a way that she continues to earn income and her nutrition is continually improving. But Fatima faces a number of shocks, and one of those might be dry spells or variable rainfall that upsets her production. So what are things that Fatima might need, and when might she need them? Well, first of all, she might need information about when to plant and when to apply fertilizer in order to prevent crop losses due to a slow onset of the rainy season. She might also need adapted quality seed varieties specially formulated for her climate and soil conditions where she lives. That will help her reduce the exposure that she has to this shock so that the impacts of that shock might be less. Finally, she might need a secure off-taker or a buyer for her production in advance of facing a shock, so she knows there's a set price that she's going to receive, and she can start to plan financially about the risks that she might face along the way. But once she's facing dry spells and variable rainfall, what else might she need so that the effects of the shock don't deter her from her goal? Savings might be one resource, and she might use those savings to buy food, which she uses to supplement having lower production and fewer sales, so she's still able to maintain her household's nutrition status. Similarly, Fatima may need a second income source that isn't affected by variable rainfall and dry spells, so she has another form of income coming into her household, and she's able to continue at least some form of income generation, and she has money to buy food with. So this is kind of the trajectory that we'd want to see for resilience, that even when shocks and stresses happen, we can access and use different resilience capacities at the right time and in a way that actually prevents or mitigates the effects of shocks and stresses. At a very, very simple definition, and this is key for understanding market systems resilience, resilience capacity is both the things that we have and, critically, the things that we do in the face of a shock or a stress. If we don't articulate how we're using resources to address risk, then we don't see the resilience change. So that part is really critical. Finally, I'll leave you with this. Shocks and stresses happen at different levels. So resilience capacities are needed at different levels. At the individual and the household level, for market actors, and then at a broader systems level. We need to be thinking about how our program can support resilience capacities at all these different scales simultaneously. Thank you.